welcome everyone with a land acknowledgement. The University of Alberta respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant communities today. I would like to remind people that this territorial statement is one of the first steps of reconciliation and should not be considered as like a passing statement and shouldn't be taken as lightly. So for the introduction, historically and contemporarily, traditional philosophy excluded feminist philosophy and argued that it's not real philosophy. I wanted to create a space where we address the invisibility and the dismissal of queer and or feminine in philosophy. We as interlocutors today will explore queering the whole discipline of philosophy and address the issues that arise when we assume queer theory as non-essential. Philosophy is built based on foundations of anti-feminist rhetoric. So the umbrella question that we're gonna talk about today is what are the harms to philosophy that are produced when we as philosophers define queer philosophy as not actual philosophy. Our discussion, we're hoping it to be more nonchalant than like an academic panel discussion. And like just as like pals hanging out and like doing like sick philosophy. My name is Soyoung, and I'm the primary organizer for a student group on campus called Underrepresented Genders in Philosophy. I'm currently a third year philosophy and women's and gender studies student, and I don't have preferred pronouns. I'll be one of the panelists today. Introduce.
I get to introduce myself. Yay! Hi folks, my name is Mika. My pronouns are she, her, they, them. I am the president of Feminists at U of A. I don't know if that's important here, but I am a fourth year women and gender studies major and a philosophy minor. And oh boy, I got some things to say today. So that is me.
So I'm Simone, Medina, Polo. I graduated from Concordia University of Edmonton in philosophy and English. I have gone on to do a couple of international conferences. So one of them that is worth noting is contemporary issues in contemporary phenomenology, which took place in Warsaw, Poland, and also the sixth Derrida today. A lot of my work is pertaining psychoanalysis, deconstruction, and phenomenology as a way of engaging basically with the question that we're going to be dealing with today, how to queer philosophy or how to engage with these presumptions that figure what counts as philosophy and who is a philosopher on those matters. Mm-hmm. So I'm also the lead coordinator of the Soy Machine Factory Interdisciplinary Outreach. So I'm very much dedicated on bridging gaps between academic and non-academic communities.
Yeah. Before I forget, I just want to say a huge thank you to APIRG for giving us funding, and to the landing, Katie, for working with me and making this happen. With that. Yeah.
So moving on to why philosophy sucks.
Ooh. Okay. Would you like to start us off?
Sure. I was trying to think about this question, and I think it's worth going back to feminist philosophy in terms of what it means to do an intervention in philosophy. Traditionally speaking, philosophy often gets defined in terms of like you're overcoming, you're giving conditions. You can picture a sage or a classical philosopher as someone who overcomes their different assumptions to come across some sort of exclusive truth that is only arrived through certain exercises and certain forms of basically mental gymnastics to arrive to. This way in which we have defined philosophy has come with the consequence that, first of all, truth has become something exclusive. So the everyday has been basically discarded in a certain sense. And when we think about the question of why a feminist intervention is important to philosophy, generally speaking, it's important to think about someone like Aristotle, first of all. As a key example of something that went wrong in philosophy, how we defined woman, for example, is the way he presented woman or the subjugation of woman was in a pre-political sense. He was trying to come up with a what we may call a classical metaphysical account of woman. And what this means is that he was trying to come up with some form of internal notion of what woman was, despite any contingent political situations, despite any contingencies that reshape what our understanding of such a notion was. I think the key importance to a feminist intervention of philosophy was politicizing woman, essentially not taking for granted this pre-political account of what woman is as a way of basically maintaining a certain form of subjugation. Aristotle essentially pulled the same move on slaves. They were, by essence, that. So we should even question their status and position in the world. So the key importance, I think, comes with a form of feminist philosophy, and I think by virtue of the tradition, queer philosophy for the matter, is the question of what does an intervention in philosophy look like, especially in the terms of what we take as given and granted in the world. How is it that the orientation of philosophy is itself dependent on how is it that we even define who counts as philosophers, who is in philosophy, and how is it that, I think that's a point of starting.
Mm-hmm. I really like the idea of like resistance towards this notion of philosophy, because fun fact for y'all, we're supposed to be in our philosophy of ethics class right now, but we're here instead. So
I forgot I had class right now.
she's like, oh, I'll meet you all at 1:15. I was like, why are we meeting at 1:15? Class starts at 1. I was like, oh, I see how it is. Okay. But I think it's really interesting to bring about that perspective that I can't speak for you, but that I definitely feel in that philosophy class, because abundance of the participants, meaning those who speak over everyone else, is, would you say, white cis men?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And we sit in the corner, and I feel very excluded from the conversation, mostly because I like to separate myself from the academic side of philosophy debates. I usually save that for the women gender side, but I think that's really interesting, because I was just sitting here and I was like trying to write my philosophy paper, and I'm like, I don't understand this, and I don't really get it. I'm not really agreeing with a lot of this, and I was like, I don't understand how we can rely on all these perspectives. And then I was like, oh, all these perspectives are white men from just ages ago, and that's what philosophy is. So then when you factor in queer philosophy, which is intended to challenge those ways that we think about it, why is queer philosophy then so excluded? And why are the folks who identify as queer philosophers othered?
Like, the problem is pretty much fundamental. The moment we ask a question, we presume too much of what counts as a domain of answers. Mm-hmm. So I would say any sort of philosophical act is often started by a sort of foundational blind spot. I already discount something in questioning, for example. Mm-hmm. In essence, that's what methodology does. It filters what counts into a certain inquiry, generally speaking. So the way in which philosophy has been partaken is, rules are always based on the back of exceptions. And in this case, exceptionality it's built on queer bodies, racialized bodies, a lot of oppressed bodies, generally speaking. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, the problem is quite deeply ingrained in the tradition of philosophy. Mm-hmm. The moment you ask a question, you already played yourself and played everyone else around you.
I don't have
It's a big trap. Mm-hmm. I think you guys did a really good job in like talking about it, the first couple points, but I think that it really unsettles philosophers when we're just like, let's kind of like challenge the foundations that we have built over these like centuries based on a very narrow definition and like values. And when like queer philosophers come in and they're just like, oh, this is kind of problematic, that's kind of problematic, like they just get really like
flustered.
They're just like, well, what do you mean? Like everything has been based on this, and we haven't like had all these debates to like prove it. It's just like wasn't very inclusive about it. Mm-hmm.
Like they don't know how to address the excessive exception that philosophy has built upon. So whenever it's brought up, they don't even know where to start.
Yeah.
Especially because that's not necessarily something that they have taken into account because of their personal experience or something of the sort, right? Mm-hmm. And it becomes pretty difficult engaging with people that don't know how to, for example, take note of a radical difference on how one goes about philosophizing. I think one example that I can think about comes from a book called Queer Phenomenology by Sarah Ahmed. Shout out. And one of the main points she actually starts working with is when we're looking at how a philosopher talks about their process of reflection or something of the sort, it tells you a little bit of how they orient themselves around a certain given life world. So the example that Sarah Ahmed works out of is the notion of a desk, which comes up time and again in philosophical reflections. In this case, it was Edmund Husserl's desk. And she goes on to comment about how this is telling us about how a philosopher orients themselves in their work, whether that's the pen on the paper that they're working on at the moment, whether that's the desk that they are working on, and what things does that sort of orientation put out of play. So for example, we don't really hear Husserl talk about domestic labor, for example, or about any relationships he has with his children or something of the sort. Actually, Husserl is a methodologist par excellence, in the sense that he kind of discounts a lot of things that don't have concerns for what he has deemed an essential questioning. So in the case of what Ahmed tries to point out for us is how literally the spacing or the things I'm writing about tell me a little bit about what my orientation as a philosopher and what Kansas philosophy is. So it'll become very apparent once you have someone who is trying to discount all of that. If you experience certain things, you can tell immediately who is discounting you from questioning. It's this question of like visibility and optics too, because it comes down to this question of we don't always see the same things in the same thing, exactly. Right? And so, for example, like a person who comes from a traditional philosophical background, who is a cis white man, in their questioning will see different things that a queer person may notice, for example, or a queer person of color may notice. And in order to make those things apparent, well, that's a different kinds of mental gymnastics that I personally think philosophy cannot achieve.
Could you briefly talk a little bit about how philosophy, like especially like academic philosophy and not public philosophy, does not really keep up with the times? Because I think that's really important to address before we talk about why. Yeah, talk about why.
I think what you mentioned earlier, Soyoung, about how like the foundational parts of philosophy are built upon premises that were formed centuries ago, and so when we try to factor in historical thinking into a modern day practice, it's very hard to do so because we have to situate ourselves into that framework of thought. But when we do that in the practical sense, that doesn't account for the modern changes and the amount of marginalized bodies that exist nowadays in philosophy. So when you think about how we can exhibit queer philosophy, when you're thinking about this foundation that's all historical thought that doesn't account for them nowadays, it's impossible. So how can, again, it's the question of like, how can we resist this when it's all we know in philosophy? And I don't want to like say that all philosophy is wrong, because it's not, but.
I guess kind of the problem I'm seeing is how can philosophy think about a form of non-philosophical intervention, which I find is oftentimes what a form of, for example, coming from a like activist perspective, philosophy is not going to tell me shit about how I'm going to act in my political living, ultimately. There's always this radical suspense of the kinds of judgments that I can draw as a philosopher by working certain determinate judgments of what counts as a certain question, as a certain problem, and whatnot. So there's a certain point in which philosophizing is not going to take me anywhere, right? Philosophy always seems to call back to itself, like coming back to the same premises, calling back to its own tradition, whatever it claims to be its tradition too. So the problem I have with philosophy is that it constantly calls back for itself rather than, again, helping us face that space of intervention in the non-philosophical. So that's why, again, I think philosophy actually can help us so much with that, oftentimes. Yeah.
So building off that point then, how does queer philosophy intersect with that inability to act? Like when you can't use philosophy to actually spark change in your own, like in your own society, how can queer philosophy fill that gap?
Right. I find that, especially over the last 200 plus years, there's been an attempt at trying to break this sort of issue with philosophy, right? Like this is the whole issue that started happening with Hegel, that we're facing the end of philosophy, the end of history, the end of discourse, the end of all these things over what we can talk about. Have we all been consuming to a philosophical system that wholly comprehends us, even to the point that it doesn't even matter what I think about it? That's where we start to this area where we have to think about singular spaces for intervention, for example. And I think a lot of different people have tried to do this in different ways. Some people still find spaces to compromise with philosophy, where they still return back to philosophy to do whatever philosophical reflections they need to do to survey their, landscape of what thought and truth is. And for some people, it means legitimately having a disconnect from philosophy to partake in a very different activity. So you'll find that a lot of people have gone to say that the end of philosophical thought may be something like, in the sense of someone like Soren Kierkegaard, it was faith. In the sense of someone like Karl Marx, it was praxis. We start having this question like, what is an afterthought to philosophy in two senses? What is it that philosophy hasn't quite thought about in this sort of foundational blind spot to how it starts its domain of questioning and asking and thinking whatever counts as answers? And an afterthought literally is like, what happens after philosophy? What do we do after we are done doing this process of reflection and coming back to, as I guess, philosophical withdrawal?
It's funny because what you said kind of reminds me of like prison abolition.
Okay.
Like when you think of a system that's so structured to be a certain way and produce certain thinkers, is like there a way that like that sort of philosophy can adapt to an element of queerness and like adapt different ways of thinking, or is it so flawed? God. Is it so flawed that we have to kind of dismantle the whole structure in order to insert ourselves to like actually think of our lived experiences in a philosophical manner?
Right. Like even that itself is like displacing the place where philosophy happens reshapes how the determinative reflections that may come from it are. As simple as like, I'm thinking from the place of being literally here in front of a stage in front of you all will be very different than what sort of reflection I do, let's say, talking about philosophy at the door sewing machine factory, or talking about philosophy with my roommates or something of the sort. The place, when we displace a place of thought, I think that's a form of intervention of what happens as thought. Yeah. And so the problem I have with a lot of classical philosophy is just oftentimes there's a way of not accounting for this form of displacement or this sort of place where thought happens. This is often what, in my experience and in terms of how I think about philosophy, I think this is a lot of what this is an excessive, excluded blind spot of how classically we done philosophical problems. So, yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to what is the place where thought happens, and how is it that, again, this sort of condition of philosophy is ultimately a space for non-philosophical intervention too.
Yeah. So then those little acts of resistance could be in like forms of intervention, like just kind of talking about it with your roommates or questioning how certain things are. Like, interesting.
Yeah, like it makes me think, for example, how I'll explain philosophy very differently to very different people.
Right.
If I know that someone is a little bit more directed towards, let's say, arts as opposed to sciences, well, I'll give you more arts examples. And I may even show you a few like scientific examples to see how the same point translates onto the sciences, for example, just to kind of get that across. So it's this curious thing about how even the very encounter with another interlocutor reframed is this form of like displacement of the philosophical questioning itself. So my preoccupation is just philosophers that try to do exactly the same thing with every one person. So this presumption to a very obscure sense of universality that philosophy has maintained for so long, that humans are universal without accounting for a lot of different like radically contingent and concrete aspects that affect the very singularity of every one human being. And that gets more complicated when we're dealing with power and politics. Yeah.
I had something in my head, but it's like formulating, but then like the more that I'm like sitting on it, it's like disintegrating almost.
That's philosophy right there. I think the power dynamics is super interesting as well, because I'm writing a paper on this. But how can we have a sound justification of instrumental morality? And I'm thinking a lot about this and how we can factor in structural inequality. Because, say for example, we're at a space where like queerness can intersect with classical philosophy. I don't know how, but great. Now what? Like, how can philosophy actually account for these structural inequalities? How can we account for marginalized bodies when throwing out a type of morality that is universal?
Right. Yeah, I think, especially because, again, 200 years down the line, we're starting asking questions about the radically singular, whatever cannot be completely incorporated into a systematic account of universality.
Yeah.
And so, I think there's being a little bit of work done in terms of people trying to find how to think the radically singular. And oftentimes it comes to be as simple as like, what is it that I haven't accounted for in my experience that I experience, first of all, as a radical break of whatever I have already kind of systematized into my head, right? Like we all have a sense in which we edify our own concepts and thoughts to the point that it always feels like we're just talking soliloquies to ourselves in a certain sense. But the curious thing is when we have this encounter that breaks the sense of soliloquy, I guess. Yeah. When we encounter some other that reframes how we have to think ourselves around, and we don't know how to put the other to words. It's almost indiscernible, or it's in a sense irreducibly indeterminate for however I try to think it. So for example, I can have an encounter with another person, and it becomes this question like, in trying to think you, am I making you me? Right? And so when it becomes this question about how do I engage with a reducible question of encountering another person. It's something that both shows the sort of opening of philosophy in a certain respect, but also it shows the possibility of philosophy just trying to consume everything into the same, into this homogeneous approach, right? And so for me, I've been seeing that there's a couple of ways of going about it. There's people that will still sustain a form of general universality where everything is comprehended into this constant self-developmental sense of philosophy. And then there's a question that I would like to invite to consider: how do we mind the gaps to your thought? How do we mind the gaps to what we determine to count as thought? How do we encounter with those, I guess, excesses that we discounted when we first start philosophically asking questions, which will come back to haunt us time and again. I think that's the biggest problem I have sometimes with cis white philosophers, that even though this problem comes back to haunt them, it's not really a problem to them.
I think that one thing that so I study ancient Greek philosophy, which is like the opposite of like queer philosophy, and feminism, it's just, but the one thing that I appreciate Plato doing is that he tries to define things based on people's experiences. It just happens to be like a cis male privileged experiences. So I think like when I don't know how it's gonna really work in philosophy per se, but like we still try to define things with experiences, or we kind of like try to like incorporate it. And I think when we talk about queer philosophy and indigenous philosophies that kind of like really differ from how like traditional like Western philosophy works, I think like we kind of like could mend that gap of universality, like that concept of universality.
Like basically the gap between different places where thought is happening.
Yeah.
Like one of the issues we had with academic philosophy is that the way we count someone as a philosopher, well, you have to have a degree and you have to have a certain amount of work that you publish and all this kind of jazz, right? Like you can come up with a list of things that make you count as a philosopher. But it comes to this question of who gets discounted. Like we experienced that in a discussion that we worked at where we started wondering, like, well, we have discounted Aboriginal elders from counting as places of truth, of wisdom, of places where philosophy happens, or even children's ponderings. Like they unlike us adults, don't have a concept of philosophy that works against them when they're just literally trying to wonder what the hell is going on. So we find that there's a lot of places where thought happens that we only experience as a sort of gap, right? And this is where I find, and this is me kind of being a psychoanalysis person, but I find that the issue that happens then, especially for traditional philosophers, is that when you encounter that gap, you're looking to fill that gap. That's what fantasy does in a certain respect. And I would say that philosophy is very tied to a form of fantasy still, in the sense of like, you are still pursuing some sort of desire you're trying to realize, the love of wisdom. You're trying to pursue around this thing in some respect. And my preoccupation sometimes with some philosophers is that this pursuit of wisdom is trying to be fully incorporating whatever the wise thing is into yourself, fully consuming the other, rather than minding the gap.
I think that's so interesting that you're talking about the gap, and then we factor in that's where the power dynamics come from, because when you're trying to understand like queer philosophies or indigenous philosophies, but you've never been in a situation so marginalized that you can like understand those experiences, how do you go about trying to understand these other philosophies? Well, you have to reflect on your own experiences, but your own experiences are too privileged to narrow down to that particular one. So then it's kind of interesting, Simone, what you were saying, like, do we consume all these experiences? And is it a way of like minding that gap so we can begin to understand each other, or is it more so that we're trying to consume them into our own understanding of how things work, and then therefore we're minimizing their own lived experience, and then we're just bringing it back to like the default of classical philosophy?
Right, like this this flattening of the radically other.
Yeah.
And when we flatten the other, well, we're literally just commodifying people for our own self-serving.
Yeah, and I think it like perpetuates like the whole power systems that exist.
So
I want to throw my coffee across the room.
It's like this makes me we had a talk about this, but like this like system of like power structure that is like validated and like justified through philosophy, and like the like doing actions of like the action of philosophy kind of creates this like a power dynamic almost with the interlocutors between them, and this like made me question like, do we need to philosophize at this point then? Like because we have all these like different theories that's outside of philosophy that are kind of philosophy, but like philosophy is like pushing it out.
like what's properly the afterthought of philosophy, to the
Yeah,
point that we
like-
don't even need to go back to philosophy.
Yeah, I like, for example, the example that I was thinking was like gender identity. I don't think necessarily needs to be philosophized in a way that we philosophize things. Like,
Because when you philosophize it to that extreme that you would do in classical philosophy, you begin to question the validity of it.
yeah.
And that's not something that we want to do in a practical sense. But that kind of brings back to like the ultimate point, like what are the harms of queer philosophy and like queer theory per se when it's not counted as actual philosophy? I'm kind of like, well, that's the whole point of queer theory, is that we don't want to be involved and included. We want to be included, but we don't want to be part of the mainstream. So in that essence, is there a harm? Oh, I threw us all for a loop.
Oh, shit. I'll go home.
What kind of harms?
I think ultimately it comes back to that fear of us being consumed into the default of what philosophy has become. If we are fighting so hard to be included in a certain kind of philosophy that's used to only working and thinking in one way, are we just going to fall into that narrative? Or are we ultimately aiming to bring philosophy to?
So basically, are you saying that that our experiences could be flattened and commodified for the philosopher?
Commodified or totally just minimized?
Minimized,
Like,
right. So the intervention is turning to, this is actually a non-problem. We don't need to take it too seriously in a sense.
Not saying that it's a non-problem.
Well, for the philosopher, that the philosopher
Yes.
would take it as a problem just insofar as it pertains philosophy,
Yeah.
but in the radical extent in which this is a lot more than just philosophy, it gets flattened out and commodified in that respect.
Right.
Yeah. I think.
Able to propose a way to philosophize queerness without falling back into those traditional.
I do think I have a little bit to say about that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
In terms of my own personal experience, when I first came out as a trans woman, I was in the Judith Butler, Michelle Foucault train, you know? I just wanted to understand how I'm a subject to power and how that constitutes me and who I am. And I am actually currently going through the process of like, I'm coming out again as a trans woman. I was identifying as non-binary for some time. And the second time around that I came out, I realized that to try to theorize it, to try to mediate my experience through theory, through this proceeding models, it had this way in which it was just to some extent pedantics to a non-philosophical experience. So my intention is like, we don't need to fully disregard philosophy altogether, because it still can help us ask questions that we need to be asking about who we are. In some respect, like coming out to terms with gender identity does come down to a form of philosophical question. Who am I? How am I understood by other people, and where I stand in these relations? And I think this is the key word, there's something happening besides philosophy. So we can almost think about parallel works. So the philosophical work and a sort of non-philosophical work. And so it's important to mind that gap between those two, the non-relationship between philosophy and something non-philosophical, which may very well intervene upon one another, but there's a certain extent in which we need to mind the gap between them. Not all occasions are an occasion to ask a philosophical question. I'm not sure, I mean, maybe, I'm not gonna ask a philosophical question at a funeral unless it is something that is actually within the terms of how is it that we are engaging, let's say, with like mourning or wondering where we go from there. But not all occasions are an occasion for philosophy. Maybe under reserve for something we can philosophize about, but there's a certain point where if we are doing this chase of when am I going to sufficiently philosophize to do anything about my life, well, we played ourselves from the get-go. So
philosophy can only go so far.
yeah, I think there's a certain point where philosophy has to be suspended. The processes of philosophy and its determinate reflections need to be suspended for a form of intervention, which could really radically change what is philosophy, what counts as philosophy, as well as the processes that it would undergo. Yeah.
I think queer theory is currently trying to do that very hard.
I think so. Like that's what I see with Sarah Ahmed in terms of like queering phenomenology,
Yeah,
right?
like the whole, like taking a very like structured traditional concept and like trying to like fuck shit up in it, like by like being like, you know, like by being like, this isn't yeah, but I just like I have such a hard time grasping, like I feel like if we start bringing in queer theory, like we just like won't need philosophy at all anymore. Like it just doesn't make it's at least maybe like in academia, like we still talk about like Socrates and like how he like jerks everyone off and like you know, and like Aristotle being like Socrates is fucking ugly, or like that's the extent of like my philosophical knowledge. But I think like in public philosophy, like if we have queer philosophy and like so I keep bringing back indigenous philosophy into it. Like I don't know if we need traditional Western philosophy anymore.
I mean, it's been dead for so long,
Yeah.
so
And
it's
I
been
think
200
there's a
years.
good reason for it. Like I think there's a reason why people are just like, oh, like what the fuck? Why are you studying philosophy? Why are you studying ancient Greek philosophy? I think like, right? There's like a reason for that. So yeah, what do you guys think?
So if you stepped aside from like the academic side of classical Western philosophy, how can you like use that in practice? Like, what purpose does it serve when you have queer theory and queer philosophy in its place?
I think one problem that I would do for that is like, yeah, I had certainly issues with classical philosophy, but the problem is that if I didn't have an understanding of classical philosophy, I wouldn't know when I'm repeating the same shit that has been done for like several thousand years. And so the problem right now that we're facing, and that goes hand in hand with the current crisis of modernity that's permeating everywhere, is recognizing how we are constantly trying to return to this functional sameness that's constantly like breaking itself down. It's driven by death currently, in the sense that this crisis is currently influencing hate groups, it's influencing a lot of like radical extremists in the right, in terms of like, let's return to these traditional values that are just shutting themselves down constantly, slowly.
Right.
So if I didn't have an understanding of genealogy and philosophy where all these concepts have a right into their exhaustion, then I would also come across the issue of I can't come to recognize where I'm actually seeing something that's radically different from that.
Yeah.
Right? Because I could very well act as if something different is happening, which is just the same stuff that's been going on for some time.
So can we conceptualize queer theory then as a response to all the harms done by this classical Western philosophy? Or is there a way that like we can have queer theory and queer philosophy standing on its own?
Right. I think it's gonna be pretty much informed still.
Yeah.
One of my preoccupations still with queer theory is that it runs the risk of still returning to dogmatic forms of thinking. And that's a preoccupation we should generally try to have about anything that claims to be radically different, unfortunately. Just as a way of understanding like how much are we replicating the same kind of violences that we have undergone. My personal question that is more so along the lines of what does an intervention philosophy look like? And if philosophy is driven by form of fantasy that discounts a lot of things and put them out of play, what does that disruption of the philosopher's fantasy look like as a way of opening spaces for, again, queering philosophy? Which I find is very akin to occasions where I started coming to terms with queerness. I see something that disrupts a certain fantasies of like, oh, I'm a man, I'm gonna shovel my lawn, and I'm gonna you know, just those absurdities. But that kind of captivates this disruption of the fantasy. I don't even know how to fantasize that way quite the same anymore. But it has this effect on how you even start considering how you think, how it orients itself, right? So for me, that's kind of the question. It's not so much like I think that if there's any sort of space for queerness in philosophy, is to the extent that it's a disruption of philosophical processes,
Yes.
right? So, yeah.
And then we can factor that into your work this year, where you I'm plugging your group here, but you founded, it has a different title now, but Underrepresented Genders in Philosophy, which when you told me about that, I was like, oh my god, that's so necessary, and I never even realized it. But would you want to kind of tell us a little bit more about what the direction it's headed in?
Okay, so it was initially like, it wasn't set up by me. It was actually set up by like grad students. I just inherited it because no one else wanted to take it. But it was like to address sexism, like institutional sexism that's based in philosophy, and like the ways we talk about philosophy. Like there's a lot of like microaggressions against gender minorities, and like really high invisibility against like non-binary people and trans people in the community. It was to address, I guess, like I wanted, like our goal when we kind of started was to integrate like our perspectives into classrooms and encourage people in academia to like come partake in academia and like bring a new different perspective so that like it will grow.
Sorry, bring people in academia to partake in academia?
What?
Oh, sorry. I was just wondering if you were saying that like people in academia should partake in academia.
Like, no, encourage people to partake in academia. Like, so like a lot of times like gender minorities aren't very well represented in academic philosophy. So we're hoping that at least in our faculty we would encourage like more of gender minorities to go to conferences, like apply for like to get published and stuff like that. And it was kind of like a communal like support group, I guess. And it was very wholesome. It just like doesn't really exist anymore because no one goes.
Even that could be seen as like a disruption to the classical like ways of thinking in philosophy.
But yeah, I think like what we wanted to do initially was kind of focus on gender as like a way of disrupting the whole like classroom environments and the faculty environment and the climate.
So with the climate of like the classroom in philosophy like discussions can be, it can include lots of microaggressions like you would say. So like how can little interventions like this step in and act as like forms of intervention like Simone was saying, or little acts of resistance towards that typical way of thinking?
I think like just because that people like we in our seminars like people kind of like have same ideas or opinions on same things unless you have a different identity, if that makes sense. So then like for example in my ancient Greek philosophy seminar last semester, like there like a lot of people were just kind of like, there were some people who were just like, yeah, like what Plato is saying about women like kind of makes sense. Yeah, Plato's a feminist. I had to like fight someone about whether Plato is a feminist or not, because he was just like, oh yeah, women can also be like rulers, but there's still.
But I think that kind of like misses the entire point of the feminist intervention, right?
Yeah,
like
so
that, like breaking out of this classical metaphysical dogmatic account, like woman is something substantial and essential. Substance is dead, like.
Yeah. So I guess like what I'm trying to say is that like by just having like a perspective of, or like bringing in like knowledge, also academic knowledge, I guess, of like feminism into a space where it's always like not accessible. Is like a way of kind of like what we hope to break down in the faculty at least.
How do you know time?
We so this was going till 2:20, but we started a little bit later. It's 2:15 at the moment. We could also like take a few questions for people,
Yeah.
see like what people have to say about that.
I've been like facing this way and I keep them like, oh my god, there's a whole crowd over
Okay,
here.
let's do you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering in terms of queer interventions to philosophy, how that goes into thinking about the history of philosophy. I think part of the whole white cis male fantasy is a particular interpretation of the history of philosophy myself. I know one question I ask myself all the time is, how do we know all these people are cis? Like, why is this the assumed?
Mm-hmm. Like you can find like queer readings of certain philosophers who have encounter moments where like there's something, for lack of a better expression, queer about the way they're orienting themselves around a certain question or something of the sort.
Yeah, something like that. Like,
yeah.
can we interpret, for example, Descartes or meditations as dysphoria? And I don't think ultimately we can because it's too historically separated. But why are we assuming that it's not?
Right. Like if we take the example, because that's actually the one example I was thinking about too. Like Descartes' meditations is taking us to this point where like he's literally trying to doubt everything to bring us back to it, right? So he's not quite having this dysphoric movement into transition because he's still coming back to the same things. He's just now feeling more certain about it. He's feeling more certain about being cis and all that kind of jazz. If we can even apply the concept at that point in time. But there's a certain interesting point because in the history of philosophy, for example, after we end up with the Cartesian cogito, so the I think therefore I am, that is regardless of whether I'm a man or a woman or anything of the sort, there were a lot of people trying to draw feminist insights from that. Oh, mine has no gender. What are we gonna do with that? So it definitely amounted to a sort of a form of queer intervention in philosophy because you would find people, and I can't think at the top of my head of the specific philosopher that tried to kind of pursue that, but there was someone who tried to take on this kind of feminist intervention from Descartes' cogito, and then I think a couple writings later just backtrack completely on that, just to reinstate again the same state of affairs in relationship to power and other structures. So it's this interesting queer intervention where you can see this kind of parallax view of how people try to register what happened there. There's an emancipatory potential in terms of like a potential feminist intervention, but at the same time, people want to return to kind of the same bullshit, in a sense. So there's definitely various occasions in the history of philosophy where you can have little queer encounters, but for them to fully consume a philosopher, it's kind of a different question sometimes. Some people still find ways of resisting being too influenced by that encounter, for example. Yeah. Mira.
Hey, thanks for this. I was thinking about when we were talking about how queer theory, I think it was Simone, you brought up this point of how queer theory is always going to reference back to a Western canon, and I think that I've been thinking about a lot is the way that like queer theory as its own kind of whatever like institution is very much grounded in that Western canon and like therefore the limits of that. And I'm wondering both like y'all's own experience with queer theory that does not like
Fall into that
or say onto
framework of thought.
to the Western canon, and also like ways that can be like that like Western queer theory, for lack of a better word, can be like challenged by like new queer theory.
I'm studying currently Indigenous feminism, and we talk about how mainstream feminism and even queer theory is not inclusive enough and does not center Indigenous people. That decolonialization happens. Like it's kind of done as like more of a passing thing. I think that's like a way of challenge, like coming from like a decolonial perspective. I think like whenever we talk about something being based on like a Western perspective, when we bring in like a non-Western perspective that's situated in Western areas, so like Indigenous perspectives, I think like it really challenges how the dialogue is being said and how like what are the assumptions that are being made. So like for example, like mainstream feminism kind of like assumes that everyone wants to be like inclusive and like partake in the advocacy of like equality, when like for focus on like decolonialization than like it sees the main oppressor as like the colonialism instead of the patriarchy, even though patriarchy kind of like fits underneath.
Again, exploit them.
Yeah, basically.
And like the impression I'm getting is that there's the possibility of something more queer than queerness in a sense, the way we define it. I think I would say that this is not necessarily just exclusive, these forms of interventions I don't think are just exclusive to a Western canon though, because I do think it is quite possible to happen in canons that are not strictly the Western canon, though the Western canon does have the consequences that, for example, you outlined, Soyoung.
Yeah.
So I think the form of intervention we see in something like a queer encounter can occur besides the Western canon, but the way we currently understand it is often coming back in reference to it as a way of like understanding what like constructed sense of normalcy gets disrupted by something. So
I think that's a really good point, because back to your question about like trying to embrace queer theory without falling into those old norms that we've been so structured to act according to. It's very hard, but I think like when we think about the term queer, not just queerness like Simone mentioned, but like queer as in to fuck with something. This is my academic definition. But
that's a good one.
thank you. Mika Burns, quote me. But we have to think about like if we're going to act in accordance with queer theory, which as I say that is a really contradicting statement because that's what queer theory is all about. Basically you want to like continue to act in against the norms that you've been so accustomed to learn. And that goes in kind of with classical Western philosophy, but at the same time we're living in a society that very much heavily depends on that.
Yeah.
So to avoid that overlap is very hard, but the ongoing struggle doing so is kind of the point of queer theory as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
So
Earlier you mentioned about how philosophy needs to be a little bit more accessible in terms of like gender. Do you think that there needs to be more accessibility in philosophy like outside of academia? Especially if like Western philosophy like is so messed up already, like how would you go about that?
right, like how can you actually have a clean break from this, or actually like break from that if you keep coming back to basically the same crap? Do you want to give it a shot?
It's a big question.
I want to talk about children. I think when we have like philosophical conversations with kids, we're not philosophizing in terms of academia, because they're just like a lot of different concepts are new to them and they're processing it in their own experiences, and they verbally communicate it to you, and then you as like the other is like shocked. Right? I had this experience where I was volunteering at a philosophy camp for like kids.
It's a thing.
Yeah, it got shut down because I think we ran out of funding or something. But it was a really good time because like I was with kids who were like in kindergarten, and they were just like, we're talking about art, and one kid was like, everything is beautiful. And then like she's just like, everything's beautiful, like there's no ugliness and whatever. And then the other kid was like, but poop is like not beautiful. Like that's the type of like philosophy that's like actually like there's a dialogue happening and there's like actual conversations and like points being made and so on. And I think like that's like an example of where we kind of like step outside of, because no one's like telling them, oh, like that's not how you're supposed to communicate when you're doing philosophy. Like the logic's like
Can you make poop into a proposition?
Yeah, like you can't, the logic isn't there or whatever. Like I think like academic philosophy relies really heavily on like how we communicate it and how we like write our essays and like how we make that argumentation. But like these kids are like talking about shit and they're just like, wow, and I'm just like, what the fuck is happening? Right? It is philosophy that's happening because they're talking about stuff and they're questioning like different things that is happening in the world and like that exist. But you know, like I think that's like, yeah, like that's
I think that's really interesting because it demonstrates that we can philosophize outside of philosophy, but at the same time, because I like to argue, we're not children. Like, so when you take it out of the innocent mind, how can you do exactly that?
How can you philosopher me like this?
Because I love it.
Because one of the general issues I see coming up at that point is when we are older, we start developing this concept of philosophy that starts working against us. We become anxious about like, am I sufficiently philosophizing? Have I kept up with the history of philosophy enough to even feel justifiable in making any one claim? So it's quite different for children. They don't have that sort of a sense of external agency, internal external agency that pesters them with that anxiety quite the same way. But to answer that question a little bit more so, I myself was asked the question at the end of my degree, where's philosophy taking place? Here or in somewhere else? Because honestly, I find that this place is kind of where philosophy comes to die. If you think about the way that the economy of universities works, you produce papers, you produce basically information that circulates in a systematic closure, a sameness of what I would describe as an archival circuitry that keeps on happening. There's no space for interventions here, quite honestly. So the forms of interventions that need to happen in philosophy cannot happen in the university, quite sincerely. For myself, for example, like I don't really want to go back to academia. I go to conferences to these people that are stuck in their chairs and try to build solidarity with those that actually are quite frustrated that they're in that position. So I find that here's where philosophy dies and the space for intervention is elsewhere. You had a question, I think.
Well, it was just in relation to kids and how they process things. They haven't developed a critical faculty until they're about 7 or 8, so they don't have those conscious biases that older people do.
Yeah.
Right, like the little question like, oh, this is not how I think. Oh, this is not. Like the sense in which a child has a sense of like borders and limits and all these things is very different. The child, when they grow up, the world feels like limitless almost. So in growing up, we come across moments where like processes of negativity or determination start happening. We experience this quite ourselves in the development of moral agency when we develop a sort of superego that tells me, hey, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And it has quite an effect of what comes across as philosophy too.
I think that the thing that I really enjoyed about that camp was that we weren't really like telling them what is correct and what is not. And like we didn't even emphasize that what they were doing is philosophy. It was just to us, we're just like, wow, these kids are philosophizing without us like giving them any basic training. And it was just kind of like the point that I was that I want to like kind of like emphasize is that like kids are kind of dumb. And like I teach kids all the time, but like I think the way that we were getting them to engage with things in that camp was specifically not in a structured way that really challenges how we do education, like the philosophy of education goes, and like how we have like a discussion and stuff. Like the only restriction that we gave them was like you can't talk over other people to be respectful, right? Like so yeah, I don't know if that like clarifies.
I mean, I still find that like like I know this is bad like pedagogy, but the saying like you don't talk over someone still has this sort of role of like you're determining what the thing will look like. You're adding a sort of like this is a limit, which is developmentally speaking, I think what was brought up in terms of like.
But it was so that the other kids wouldn't like.
yeah.
Like limit the other person's agency of like being able to talk without getting interrupted. Yeah, I don't know. Like it's always really hard to really think about stuff without.
I mean, we're adults. We're already anxious enough about how we determine these things too much. It kind of brings me to a point. Like I personally find that philosophy has stupefied me to some extent. Like there's a few non-philosophers or anti-philosophers that get to that point. Quite simply that like I literally just have problematized the entire world. There's this meme that kind of captivates that, where like there's an angel approaching God, be like, hey, you took this monkey and gave it anxiety. Come on.
Yeah.
And I feel like that sort of intervention is what philosophy has kind of done for us in a certain respect. And so seeing children, it's quite different because there's this sort of gap to be minded of like how we think about what philosophy is. Mm-hmm. And these kids don't need to call it philosophy to do whatever that's actually going on there.
Which is also very interesting because like the concept of philosophy, when we were just like, oh yeah, let's do some philosophy, then there's like an assumption in the back of our head of like what we need to do philosophy itself. I don't know where I was going with that, but like
It's back to the structure.
yeah,
Yeah.
like it's like still like you it's like
Philosophy only calls back for your structure. Like
that
we're back at
isn't
it.
as necessary currently.
We're pretty much around time. If anyone has any more questions, good to close it off then.
Good, thumbs up.
Right.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
so
everyone.
much for coming.